The day Marcus Wellington disappeared from my life started like any other Tuesday. I remember the mundane details with painful clarity, the fresh coffee I'd brewed with the beans he liked, the text I sent him about dinner plans, the way I hummed while getting dressed for work. That ordinary morning stands frozen in my memory as the last moment I still believed in us, before the ground crumbled beneath my feet and 5 years of my life dissolved into nothing. I never got a goodbye, no explanation, no closure. Just complete radio silence from the man who had promised me forever only 3 weeks earlier. 5 years together, 1,826 days of building a life, of planning a future, of believing I knew who I was sleeping beside. Then suddenly, nothing. Texts unanswered. Calls sent straight to voicemail. His social media accounts deactivated. It was as if Marcus Wellington had evaporated from the face of the earth, leaving behind only the ghost of what we'd been. Except I knew he wasn't dead. Death would have been more merciful than this calculated vanishing act. Death would have given me the closure of grief. This was something more cruel, a deliberate erasure of our shared history, a rejection so complete it left me questioning whether any of it had been real at all. I remember standing in my apartment that night, clutching my phone and calling his number for the 37th time. The automated voice telling me the mailbox was full had become a twisted sort of companion, the only response I could get from the life I thought I had. His toothbrush was still in the bathroom. His favorite sweater still hung in the closet. Half-read books with his bookmark still rested on the nightstand. But Marcus was gone. "He'll call," I whispered to myself, pacing the living room floor. There's been an accident, a family emergency. Something happened to his phone. I crafted 100 scenarios, each more implausible than the last, because the alternative was too painful to consider. He had chosen to leave. He had decided after 5 years that I wasn't worth even a goodbye. By day 3, panic had settled into my bones. I'd called his workplace only to be told he'd taken personal leave. I'd contacted his parents, who seemed genuinely confused but promised to let me know if they heard from him. I'd even driven to his best friend Tyler's apartment, where my frantic knocking was met with uncomfortable evasion. "I haven't heard from him," Tyler said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Maybe he just needs some space, Ava." Space. The word echoed in my head as I drove home, knuckles white against the steering wheel. Space from what? From our plans to look at houses in the spring? From the vacation we'd been saving for? From the life we'd carefully constructed together? By the end of the week, I knew. The careful way Tyler had avoided my gaze, the slight hesitation in his mother's voice. The personal items missing from the apartment, not everything, just the irreplaceable things. His grandfather's watch. The external hard drive with his photography. The small wooden box where he kept his collection of vintage concert tickets. He wasn't coming back. The realization didn't hit me all at once. It crept in slowly, like a rising tide, until I was drowning in it. 5 years. 5 years of my life invested in someone who could walk away without a word. 5 years of memories tainted by the knowledge that I had loved a man capable of such cruelty. I called in sick to work. I stopped answering messages from concerned friends. I existed in a fog of confusion and pain, replaying every moment of our relationship, searching for the warning signs I must have missed. Had I been blind? Had there been clues scattered throughout our time together, breadcrumbs leading to this inevitable abandonment? 2 weeks after Marcus disappeared, I found myself sitting on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m., surrounded by tissues and old photos, when my phone buzzed with a notification. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. For one wild, desperate moment, I thought it might be him. An explanation, an apology, anything. It wasn't. It was an Instagram notification. A mutual friend had posted a new photo. My finger hovered over the dismiss button when I caught a glimpse of the thumbnail. Something about it felt familiar. With trembling hands, I opened the app, and there he was, Marcus, smiling, his arm wrapped around a woman I didn't recognize. The geotag placed them at a resort in Cabo San Lucas. The caption read, "Week 2 of paradise with this one hard eyes talk new beginnings." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember throwing my phone against the wall so hard that the screen shattered into a spider web of cracks. I don't remember sliding down to the cold tile floor. But I must have done all those things, because that's where my roommate Emma found me hours later, curled up on the bathroom floor, surrounded by broken glass and old memories, my voice hoarse from crying. "Ava?" Emma's voice seemed to come from far away. Oh my God, what happened? I couldn't speak. I just pointed to my broken phone, the image still visible through the cracked screen. Emma picked it up carefully, studied it for a moment, and her expression shifted from concern to pure rage. "That absolute piece of shit," she whispered, kneeling beside me. That cowardly, selfish, pathetic excuse for a human being. Her anger was a lifeline, something solid to grab onto in the storm of my grief. I let her help me to the couch, let her make me tea I wouldn't drink, let her call our other friends while I stared blankly at the wall. 5 years, I finally managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. 5 years, and he couldn't even say goodbye. He just replaced me. Like I was nothing.
"You are not nothing,"
Emma said fiercely, squeezing my hand. "He's the nothing. He's less than nothing. He's scum." But her words couldn't touch the hollow space that had opened inside me. I'd been discarded, erased, deemed unworthy of even the most basic human courtesy of a goodbye. The humiliation burned almost as much as the heartbreak. That night was the bottom of my fall. I remember thinking, as Emma finally convinced me to try to sleep, that I couldn't possibly feel worse than this. I was wrong. The next morning, I created a fake Instagram account and looked more closely at the photos. They went back nearly a month, overlapping with the last weeks Marcus and I had been together. In one image, I recognized the shirt I'd given him for his birthday. In another, they posed in front of a sunset on a beach, and the caption mentioned, "Celebrating 2 months with my soulmate." 2 months. While he was still coming home to me. While he was still sleeping in my bed. While he was still talking about our future. The rage came then, rising up from some primal place inside me. Not the hot, explosive anger that had made me throw my phone, but something colder and more dangerous. A quiet fury that cleared my head and steadied my hands. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than devastation. I felt purpose. I deleted the fake account. I gathered every photo of Marcus in the apartment and put them in a box that I shoved into the back of my closet. I changed the sheets on the bed. I rearranged the furniture. Small, symbolic acts of reclamation. I need to get away for a while, I told Emma that evening. I can't be here surrounded by him. She nodded, understanding immediately. Where will you go? I didn't have an answer then. I just knew I needed distance. From the apartment, from the city, from the life I'd built around a person who had revealed himself to be a stranger. The next day, I called my Aunt Catherine in Boston. She'd always been my safe harbor, the person I turned to when life became too much. Within a week, I'd arranged an extended leave of absence from my job, packed up the essentials, and driven the 6 hours to Boston with Emma's blessing and promise to look after my apartment. "Stay as long as you need," Aunt Catherine said, hugging me tightly when I arrived. "The guest room is yours." I'd planned to stay a month, just long enough to clear my head, to begin healing, to figure out how to move forward. But life has a way of rewriting our plans when we least expect it. Boston became my fresh start. Aunt Catherine's warmth and wisdom provided the safe space I needed to begin rebuilding myself. Her home, a beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, became my sanctuary. During those first few weeks, I barely left the house except for long, aimless walks through the historic neighborhoods, letting the cold New England air scour away the lingering pain. You don't have to figure everything out at once. Aunt Catherine told me one evening as we sat in her kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine. Healing isn't linear. She would know. She'd lost her husband, my Uncle James, to cancer 15 years earlier. The way she had reconstructed her life afterward had always impressed me. Now I studied her with new eyes, seeking the secret to her resilience. "How did you do it?" I asked. "After Uncle James died, how did you keep going?" She considered the question carefully, swirling the red wine in her glass. "1 day at a time. Some days 1 hour at a time." She looked at me with gentle eyes. "But the difference, sweetheart, is that James didn't choose to leave me. He fought like hell to stay." The truth of her words stung, but I needed to hear them. Marcus had chosen to leave. He had deliberately inflicted this pain. That knowledge had to mean something for my recovery. "I don't know who I am without him," I admitted quietly. "We were together for my entire adult life. I built everything around us. Then this is your opportunity to discover who you are on your own terms," she replied. "It's terrifying, but it's also freedom." Freedom. The word settled strangely in my mind. I hadn't thought of my situation that way before, as a chance rather than a catastrophe. The next morning, I woke up and did something I hadn't done since arriving in Boston. I opened my laptop and updated my resume. My previous job in marketing had been fine, but never something I was passionate about. If I was truly rebuilding, why not aim higher? Aunt Catherine had connections in Boston's business community through her work as an event planner for corporate clients. When I mentioned I was thinking about job hunting, she immediately offered to help. "Kendrick Ross just called last week looking for recommendations," she said over breakfast. "His company, Apex Digital Solutions, is expanding their marketing department. It's competitive, but I could put in a word." Apex Digital Solutions was one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. Their innovative approach to digital marketing solutions had revolutionized the industry. A position there would be a significant step up from my previous role. "I'm not sure I'm qualified," I hesitated. Aunt Catherine fixed me with a look I recognized from childhood, the one that brooked no argument. "Apply. Let them decide if you're qualified." So I did. I spent days perfecting my resume, researching the company, and crafting a cover letter that highlighted my experience while acknowledging my ambition to grow. Aunt Catherine reviewed everything, made a call to Kendrick Ross, and 3 days later, I had an interview. The Apex headquarters occupied the top floors of a sleek skyscraper downtown. As I rode the elevator up, dressed in a new charcoal gray suit that Aunt Catherine had insisted on buying me for confidence, I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement. The interview was with Sandra Chen, the Vice President of Marketing. She was everything I aspired to be: sharp, confident, and clearly brilliant. For 2 hours, we discussed marketing strategies, digital trends, and my ideas for the future of the industry. By the end, I'd almost forgotten that this had started as a distraction from my broken heart. "You have an interesting perspective, Ava," Sandra said as we concluded. "Not what I expected, but intriguing. We'll be in touch." I left feeling lighter than I had in months. Whether I got the job or not, I'd remembered something crucial. I was more than the woman Marcus had abandoned. I had thoughts, ideas, and abilities that existed independently of him. 2 days later, I received a call offering me a position as marketing project manager, a step up from my previous role. The salary was nearly double what I'd been making. The benefits were excellent. And most importantly, it represented a future I had created for myself. "I'm proud of you," Aunt Catherine said when I accepted the offer. "This is just the beginning." She was right, though neither of us could have imagined just how true her words would prove to be. I threw myself into my new job with an intensity that surprised even me. Work became my salvation, the place where the pain couldn't reach me. At Apex, I wasn't the woman who had been abandoned. I was simply Ava Mitchell, marketing project manager, known for her creative solutions and attention to detail. The first months passed in a blur of projects, meetings, and late nights. I made friends among my colleagues, professional relationships that slowly evolved into genuine connections. I found an apartment in South End, a stylish one-bedroom that had nothing in common with the place I'd shared with Marcus. I bought new furniture, chose new colors, created a space that was entirely mine. Slowly, the raw wound of Marcus's betrayal began to scab over. I still thought of him, usually late at night when the distractions of the day fell away, but the thoughts came less frequently, with less intensity. I was healing, building a life that had nothing to do with him. Then, 8 months after starting at Apex, everything changed. It began with a company-wide email announcing a new acquisition. Apex had purchased a smaller digital marketing firm based in Chicago, InnoMark Solutions, and would be integrating their team and clients into our operations. "This is huge," my colleague Jason said as we discussed the news over lunch. "InnoMark has some major accounts we've been trying to land for years." "Do you think there will be redundancies?" asked Mia, another member of our team. The question lingered uncomfortably in the air. Corporate acquisitions often meant job cuts. Sandra mentioned they're planning to retain most of the InnoMark staff. I offered. Apparently their team is part of what made the company attractive. The conversation moved on to other topics, and I thought little more about the acquisition until 2 weeks later, when Sandra called me into her office. "Ava, take a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I have an opportunity I'd like to discuss with you." My heart rate picked up slightly. In the corporate world, opportunities could mean anything from a promotion to a graceful push toward the exit. "Your work here has been exceptional," Sandra continued. "You've exceeded every expectation we had when we hired you. The executive team has taken notice." "Thank you," I said, trying not to show my nerves. "I've really enjoyed being part of the team," Sandra smiled. "How would you feel about a promotion? We need someone to head up the integration team for the InnoMark acquisition." It would mean overseeing the merger of their marketing operations with ours, managing a team of about 15 people, and ensuring a smooth transition for their clients. I blinked, momentarily speechless. This was a significant promotion, essentially a director-level position. It would come with a substantial salary increase, of course, Sandra added, and a title change to Director of Integration, reporting directly to me. I'm honored, I managed to say. But why me? I've only been with Apex for 8 months. Because you've shown exceptional judgment and people skills. Because you think strategically. And frankly, because you're not entangled in any of the internal politics that some of our longer-term managers might bring to the situation. She leaned forward slightly. New acquisitions require fresh perspectives, Ava. I think you're exactly what we need. I left Sandra's office in a daze, clutching a folder of information about the new role and the InnoMark team I would be managing. My mind was racing with possibilities. This was more than just a promotion. It was a chance to prove myself at an entirely new level. That evening, I called Aunt Catherine to share the news. I knew you had it in you, she said, her voice warm with pride. When do you start? Next Monday, I replied. I'll be flying to Chicago for 3 days to meet with the InnoMark team, then they'll be relocating to Boston over the next month. This calls for a celebration, she declared. Dinner this weekend, my treat. I want to hear all the details. As I hung up, I felt a surge of genuine happiness, the first I'd experienced since Marcus left. This promotion, this new chapter, was mine alone. He had no part in it. I spent the weekend preparing for my trip to Chicago. I reviewed the files Sandra had given me, researched InnoMark's clients and projects, and prepared questions for the team members I would be meeting. I wanted to make a strong first impression as their new director. Monday arrived, and with it my flight to Chicago. The anticipation of the new role had pushed thoughts of Marcus completely from my mind. I was focused entirely on the future, on proving that Sandra's faith in me was well placed. The InnoMark offices occupied half a floor in a modern building downtown. As I stepped off the elevator, I was greeted by their operations manager, David Lin, who would be helping coordinate the transition. Welcome to InnoMark, Ava, he said, shaking my hand firmly. We're looking forward to working with you and the Apex team. I'm excited to be here, I replied genuinely. I've been impressed by what I've seen of your work. David gave me a tour of the office, introducing me to staff members along the way. The atmosphere was understandably tense. Acquisitions always brought uncertainty, but most of the team seemed cautiously optimistic about joining Apex. This afternoon, we've arranged a department meeting so you can meet everyone at once, David explained as we walked. Our CEO will be there too. He's staying on as a consultant during the transition. We continued the tour, discussing logistics and timelines for the move to Boston. By lunchtime, I'd met most of the key players and was feeling confident about the integration process. These were talented professionals who would be assets to Apex. After lunch, David escorted me to the conference room for the department meeting. People were already filing in, taking seats around the large oval table. I stood near the front of the room, reviewing my notes one last time before addressing the group. We'll get started in just a minute, David said, just waiting for our CEO to arrive. I nodded, glancing up as the door opened again. And then time stopped. There, walking through the door with the confidence of someone who belonged, was Marcus. My Marcus, the man who had shared my bed for 5 years and then vanished without a word. The man whose absence had nearly destroyed me. The man I'd finally started to forget. Our eyes met across the room, and I watched the blood drain from his face. He froze mid-step, his expression shifting rapidly from professional composure to shock to something close to panic. For one terrible moment, neither of us moved. The room continued to function around us, people taking seats, conversations flowing, but we existed in a bubble of suspended time, locked in a moment of mutual recognition that felt like being struck by lightning. I don't know how I maintained my composure. Some deep survival instinct must have taken over, because somehow I managed to keep my expression neutral, to nod slightly in his direction as if he were any other business acquaintance, to turn back to my notes as though my entire world hadn't just been upended once again. Everyone, if I could have your attention, David's voice cut through the fog in my brain. I'd like to introduce Ava Mitchell, Director of Integration from Apex Digital Solutions. She'll be overseeing our transition to the Apex team. I looked up, forcing a professional smile as I surveyed the room, deliberately avoiding the spot where Marcus stood. Thank you, David. I'm delighted to be here today. Somehow, I made it through my prepared remarks. I spoke about Apex's vision for the integration, about the opportunities it presented, about how valued the InnoMark team was. Words flowed from my mouth on autopilot while my mind screamed a continuous loop of recognition and disbelief. Marcus Wellington was the CEO of InnoMark Solutions. Marcus Wellington was now effectively my subordinate. Marcus Wellington would have to answer to me. The universe has a strange sense of humor. After I finished speaking, David stood again. And now I'd like our CEO, Marcus Wellington, to say a few words about the acquisition from InnoMark's perspective. I forced myself to look at him, to acknowledge him with the same professional courtesy I'd shown everyone else in the room. Our eyes met again, and for a moment, I saw raw panic in his gaze before he masked it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you, David. And thank you, Ava, for that comprehensive overview. His voice was exactly as I remembered, deep, with that slight rasp that had once sent shivers down my spine. Now it just made my stomach clench. As you all know, the decision to join forces with Apex wasn't one we made lightly. I watched him as he spoke, this stranger who wore the face of the man I'd loved. He looked good, his dark hair slightly longer than he'd worn it when we were together, his shoulders broader in his tailored suit. Success had suited him. I wondered fleetingly about the woman from the Instagram photos. Was she still in the picture? Had she come to Chicago with him? Or had she too been discarded when she became inconvenient? The meeting continued, but I absorbed little of it. My mind was working overtime, processing this impossible coincidence and its implications. Of all the companies Apex could have acquired, of all the positions Sandra could have offered me, the odds were astronomical. When the meeting concluded, people began to mill about, some approaching me with questions, others gathering their things to return to work. I answered queries on autopilot, my peripheral vision tracking Marcus as he spoke with David across the room. Their conversation seemed intense, with Marcus gesturing emphatically while David shook his head. Finally, as the room cleared, the inevitable could no longer be avoided. David approached me with Marcus in tow, his expression professionally pleasant, but his eyes betraying confusion. Ava, Marcus has suggested the two of you might benefit from some one-on-one time to discuss the strategic vision for the integration. Perhaps you could use my office. Of course, I heard myself say. That would be very helpful. David led us to his office, excused himself with a comment about being available if we needed anything, and closed the door behind him, leaving me alone with the ghost who had haunted me for nearly a year. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken history. Marcus stood near the door, his posture rigid, his face a mask of careful neutrality. I moved to the far side of the room, putting the desk between us, kneading the barrier. Ava, he finally said, my name sounding strange on his lips after so long. I don't know what to say. That's familiar, I replied, my voice colder than I'd intended. You didn't know what to say a year ago either. Saying nothing and disappearing seemed easier. He flinched slightly, his eyes dropping to the floor. I deserve that. You deserve a lot more than that, I said quietly. But this isn't the time or place. We have a professional relationship to establish, and that's what we're going to focus on. His head snapped up, surprise evident in his expression. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't this controlled, businesslike response. You're right, he said after a moment. Professional boundaries. That's appropriate. I moved behind the desk and sat down, gesturing for him to take the chair opposite. The role reversal wasn't lost on me. Marcus, who had always been the more successful one in our relationship, now sitting in the subordinate position. Let's be clear about the situation, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. Apex has acquired InnoMark. I am the Director of Integration, reporting directly to the Vice President of Marketing. You are staying on as a consultant during the transition period. Our personal history is irrelevant to this professional context. Marcus nodded slowly. Understood. Though I think we should acknowledge that this is an unusual circumstance. Is it? I asked, raising an eyebrow. People have exes. Sometimes they work together. It happens. We're not exactly exes, Ava, he said, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. That would imply an actual breakup. The audacity of his statement hit me like a physical blow. I took a deep breath, willing myself to maintain composure. You're right, I said evenly. Exes implies there was closure, a conversation, basic human decency. What would you call it then? When someone shares your life for 5 years and then vanishes without a word, only to resurface on social media with someone new? He had the good grace to look ashamed. I know I handled it badly. Badly? I laughed, the sound brittle even to my own ears. That's one way to put it. Ava, No. I cut him off sharply. We are not doing this here. This is not about us. This is about the successful integration of InnoMark into Apex. That's my job, and I will do it exceptionally well because that's who I am. If you can't maintain professional boundaries, I'll have to speak with Sandra about finding another liaison for the transition. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Surprise giving way to a reluctant respect. That won't be necessary, he finally said. I can be professional. Good. I opened my laptop, signaling a shift back to business. Now, I have some questions about your client transition plans. For the next hour, we discussed the integration with a forced normalcy that was almost surreal. On the surface, we were just two professionals talking strategy and logistics. But beneath that thin veneer lay an ocean of unspoken words, of pain and confusion, of questions that demanded answers. When our meeting concluded, I gathered my things with deliberate movements, avoiding his gaze. My team will follow up with a detailed timeline for the relocation, I said, closing my laptop. I'll be here for the next 2 days if you have additional concerns. Marcus stood as I did, maintaining the careful distance between us. Ava, he said as I reached for the door handle. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I paused, my back to him, his apology hanging in the air between us. Save it, I said quietly. You're only sorry because we're in this situation. If our paths had never crossed again, you'd have been perfectly content to let me wonder forever. Without waiting for his response, I opened the door and walked out, my steps measured and controlled even as my heart raced in my chest. I made it all the way to the elevator before my hands started shaking. In the relative privacy of the elevator, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, allowing myself 5 seconds, just 5, to feel the full impact of what had just happened. Then I straightened, took a deep breath, and pushed it all back down. I had a job to do. I would not let Marcus Wellington derail me again. That evening in my hotel room, I called Sandra. I knew I needed to inform her of the situation. If Marcus and I were going to be working closely together during the integration, the potential for complications was too great to ignore. I wanted to let you know about a personal connection that might affect the InnoMark integration, I said after exchanging pleasantries. I'm listening, Sandra replied, her tone curious. Marcus Wellington and I have a history, I explained, keeping my voice professional. We were in a relationship for several years. It ended poorly. I'm confident I can maintain professional boundaries, but I thought you should be aware. There was a moment of silence on the other end. I see, Sandra finally said. Thank you for your transparency, Ava. Do you believe this will impact your ability to manage the integration effectively? No, I said firmly. I can separate the personal from the professional. If anything, I'm even more motivated to ensure this transition goes smoothly. Good, Sandra said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. That's what I expected you to say. If you encounter any issues, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I trust your judgment. The conversation left me feeling oddly empowered. I had taken control of the narrative, addressed the potential problem head-on, and received Sandra's vote of confidence. For the first time since seeing Marcus walk through that conference room door, I felt like I was back on solid ground. The next 2 days in Chicago were a balancing act. I met with various team members, reviewed projects and client files, and began formulating the integration plan. I saw Marcus in meetings and passing in hallways, our interactions unfailingly professional but charged with an undercurrent of tension that I wondered if others could sense. On my last day, as I was preparing to leave for the airport, there was a knock on the temporary office I'd been using. I looked up to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Do you have a minute?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. Briefly. "My car is coming in 20 minutes. He entered but remained standing. "I wanted to talk to you, not about work." "Marcus? Please," he interrupted. "Just hear me out. 5 minutes and then I won't bring it up again." Against my better judgment, I nodded. 5 minutes. He took a deep breath. "What I did to you was unforgivable. I know that. I've known it every day since I left. There's no excuse that can make it right." "Then why are you here?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my chest. "Because I never thought I'd see you again," he admitted. "Because now that I have, I can't just pretend our history doesn't exist. Because you deserve an explanation, even if it comes a year too late." "Actually, I don't need your explanation," I said, surprising both him and myself with the certainty in my voice. Whatever reasons you had for leaving the way you did, whether it was cowardice or selfishness or something else entirely, they're your burden to carry, not mine. Ava, no, listen to me, I continued, standing up so we were on equal footing. For months I tortured myself wondering what I did wrong, what I could have done differently, why I wasn't enough. I don't do that anymore. I've built a life that has nothing to do with you, and I'm proud of it. Whatever closure you're looking for right now, it isn't mine to give you. Marcus stared at me, clearly taken aback by my response. I understand, he said finally. And you're right. This is my burden. He moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, it was never about you not being enough. It was about me not being brave enough to face what I was feeling. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of his words. On the flight back to Boston, I replayed our conversation in my mind. There had been a time when those words would have meant everything to me, when hearing that I wasn't the problem would have been the balm my wounded heart desperately needed. Now they felt like too little, too late. The woman who had needed that reassurance no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had learned to find value in herself rather than seeking it in others' approval. When I returned to the Apex offices the next morning, Sandra called me in for a debrief. She listened attentively as I outlined my observations and recommendations for the integration. And the personal situation? She asked when I'd finished. Any concerns there? None. I replied with confidence that wasn't entirely feigned. We've established professional boundaries. It won't be an issue. Sandra studied me for a moment, then nodded. Good. The Innomark team will start relocating next week. I'd like you to personally oversee the onboarding of their senior staff. Of course, I agreed. I've already prepared a detailed plan. As I left Sandra's office, I felt a curious sense of anticipation. The next few weeks would bring Marcus and his team to Boston, placing him squarely in my professional territory. Our roles had been dramatically reversed. I was no longer the woman he had abandoned, but the director he would report to. The irony wasn't lost on me. The integration proceeded more smoothly than I had anticipated. The Innomark team began arriving in Boston in waves, with their senior staff, including Marcus, coming first to help establish operations before the rest of the employees followed. I threw myself into the work, focusing on making the transition as seamless as possible. It was challenging but rewarding, exactly the kind of project that could consume my full attention and push personal considerations to the background. Marcus, to his credit, maintained strict professionalism. In meetings, he addressed me as Director Mitchell and deferred to my decisions without question. If others noticed anything unusual in our interactions, they didn't mention it. 3 weeks into the integration, I was working late, reviewing client transition reports in my office, when there was a knock at my door. I looked up to find Marcus standing there, a folder in his hand. "The Henderson account analysis you requested," he said, stepping into the office but remaining near the door. "I thought you might want it before tomorrow's meeting." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the folder. That was thoughtful. An awkward silence fell between us. It was the first time we'd been alone together since our conversation in Chicago. "How are you settling in?" I asked finally, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "Fine," he said, then hesitated. "It's strange being back in Boston." I nodded, unsure how to respond. Boston had been our city once, the place where we'd built our life together. Now it was my territory and he was the outsider. "Your team seems to be adapting well to the change," I observed, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "They're professionals," he replied. "And you've made the transition easier than it could have been." I acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "That's my job." Marcus shifted slightly, his discomfort evident. "Ava, I know we agreed to keep things professional, but there's something I need to ask you." I tensed, immediately wary. "What is it? Does anyone here know?" "About us, I mean." The question caught me off guard. "Sandra knows we have a history. I informed her when I returned from Chicago." "No one else?" He nodded, seeming relieved. "Thank you for that discretion. It would make things complicated if it became office gossip." "I'm not interested in complicating things," I said honestly. "The past is the past." Marcus held my gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Is it?" he asked quietly. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message, a welcome interruption. "I should get back to this," I said, gesturing to the work on my desk. "Thank you for bringing the report." He hesitated as if wanting to say more, then nodded and left without another word. I stared at the door after he'd gone, my thoughts in turmoil. Despite my assertions to the contrary, the past didn't feel entirely past. Having Marcus in the same building, seeing him in meetings, hearing his voice in professional discussions, it stirred emotions I'd thought were long buried. Not love, not anymore. But something more complex, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and a strange sense of power that came from our reversed positions. For 5 years, Marcus had been the more successful one in our relationship. He had been the one with the promising career, the higher salary, the professional connections. I had supported him, celebrated his successes, built my life around his upward trajectory. And then, when he decided I no longer fit into his plans, he had discarded me without a second thought. Now I was his superior. My decisions affected his professional future. My evaluations would determine his standing at Apex. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and I couldn't deny the satisfaction it brought me. Was that petty? Perhaps. But after months of feeling powerless in the wake of his abandonment, this new dynamic felt like a rebalancing of the scales. Not revenge. I wasn't that person, but a cosmic correction that allowed me to reclaim some of what had been taken from me. The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. Marcus and I maintained our professional relationship, interacting primarily in meetings and group settings. Occasionally, we'd find ourselves alone, in an elevator, in the break room, passing in a hallway, and those moments were charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us acknowledged. The integration continued to progress well. The InnoMark team was assimilating into the Apex culture, their clients had been successfully transitioned, and the merged operations were beginning to function as a cohesive unit. Sandra was pleased with the results, which reflected well on my leadership. "I'm impressed, Ava," she told me during our monthly review. "This could have been a messy transition, but you've handled it with exceptional skill. The executive team has noticed." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely pleased by the recognition. "The InnoMark team has been collaborative, which has made the process smoother." Sandra smiled. "Don't undersell your contribution, particularly your handling of Marcus Wellington. He can be challenging from what I've heard." I kept my expression neutral. "He's been professional and cooperative." "That's not the feedback I got from our last acquisition," Sandra remarked. Apparently, he was quite resistant to changes in their approach. "The fact that he's working well under your direction speaks volumes about your leadership style." The information caught me by surprise. Marcus had always been strong-willed and confident in his opinions. It was one of the qualities I'd admired in him, but I hadn't seen that side of him during our professional interactions. He had been almost deferential, accepting my decisions without pushback even when I could tell he disagreed. Was he making a special effort because of our history? Was he trying to make amends in the only way available to him? Or was it simply that he recognized the precariousness of his position and was playing it safe? These questions lingered in my mind as the integration phase of the project began to wind down. 2 months had passed since the InnoMark team had relocated to Boston, and we were approaching the point where they would be fully absorbed into Apex's structure. Marcus's role as a consultant was coming to its natural conclusion. I knew I needed to discuss his future with the company. As the director of integration, it fell to me to make recommendations about which InnoMark employees should be retained long-term and in what capacity. It was a responsibility I hadn't anticipated when I took the position, the power to potentially end Marcus's career at Apex before it truly began. The thought made me uncomfortable, not because I feared making the decision, but because I questioned my ability to be objective. Could I separate my professional assessment from my personal history? Could I trust myself to make a recommendation based solely on what was best for Apex? I scheduled a meeting with Marcus for a Friday afternoon, when the office would be quieter and we could speak without interruption. He arrived precisely on time, his expression guarded as he took the seat across from my desk. "Thank you for coming, Marcus," I began formally. "As you know, we're nearing the end of the integration phase, which means we need to discuss your ongoing role with Apex." He nodded, his posture tense. "I've been expecting this conversation. Your contract as a transition consultant ends in 2 weeks," I continued. "Sandra has asked for my recommendation regarding your potential future with the company." Marcus met my gaze steadily. "And what will you recommend, Director Mitchell?" The formality of his address, which he only used in group settings, felt like a deliberate reminder of our professional relationship, a boundary being reinforced. "That depends," I replied honestly. "You've been an asset during the transition. Your knowledge of InnoMark's operations and clients has been invaluable, but a permanent position would require different considerations." Such as, he prompted when I paused, such as how you would function as a regular team member rather than a consultant, how you would adapt to Apex's corporate culture long term, whether your skills and experience align with our strategic direction. Marcus nodded slowly. All reasonable considerations. And do you have concerns in any of those areas? I studied him for a moment before responding. I've heard that you were resistant to changes during your previous acquisition experience. That suggests potential difficulties integrating fully into a new corporate structure. Something flickered in his eyes, surprised perhaps that I had this information. The circumstances were different, he said carefully. The acquiring company wanted to dismantle much of what made Innomark successful. It wasn't resistance for its own sake, it was protecting what worked. And you don't feel that way about the Apex acquisition? No, he said without hesitation. Apex values what we built. The integration has been collaborative rather than destructive. It's a different situation entirely. I made a note on my pad, buying time as I considered his response. It was reasonable and professionally sound. If it had come from anyone else, I would have accepted it without question. Would you like to continue with Apex in a permanent capacity? I asked directly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. Yes, he said after a moment. I believe I could contribute significantly to the company's growth. In what role? Ideally, something that utilizes my experience in strategic development and client relations, he replied. Perhaps as a senior account director or strategic planning manager. I nodded, making another note. Both positions would place him at a level below mine in the organizational hierarchy, a fact that couldn't have escaped his notice. I'll take your preferences into consideration, I said. Sandra and I will be making final decisions next week. Is there anything else you'd like me to know before I make my recommendation? Marcus hesitated, his expression conflicted. Just that I'm committed to making this work, professionally speaking. Whatever role is deemed appropriate, I'll accept it with the intention of contributing positively to Apex's success. The humility in his statement was unexpected. The Marcus I had known had been ambitious and proud, not arrogant, but confident in his worth and unwilling to settle for less than he deserved. This conciliatory approach was new territory. I appreciate your flexibility, I said, closing my notebook to signal the end of our meeting. I'll let you know once a decision has been made. Marcus stood to leave but paused at the door. Ava, he said, dropping the formal title. I know this isn't easy for you, having me here, having this power over my professional future. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I understand. The acknowledgement of our complicated situation hung in the air between us. For a moment, the professional veneer slipped, and we were just two people with a painful shared history trying to navigate an impossible situation. Thank you for understanding, I said quietly. That makes one of us at least. A sad smile flickered across his face before he nodded and left, closing the door softly behind him. That weekend, I found myself obsessing over the decision. I made lists of Marcus's professional qualities, his strategic thinking, his client relationship skills, his industry knowledge. I tried to imagine how he would fit into various roles at Apex, whether he would be an asset or a liability long term. I questioned my own motivations, examining them for traces of personal bias in either direction. On Sunday evening, frustrated by my circular thinking, I called Emma. She had been my rock during the worst days after Marcus disappeared, and if anyone could offer perspective on this situation, it was her. Let me get this straight, she said after I explained the situation. The man who ghosted you after 5 years now works for you, and you have to decide whether to keep him or let him go? Essentially, yes, I confirmed. Emma laughed incredulously. That's either cosmic justice or a cruel joke. I can't decide which. Neither can I admitted. What would you do? Fire his ass, she said immediately, without hesitation. Emma! No, seriously, Ava. After what he did to you, he doesn't deserve your consideration. This is the universe handing you the perfect opportunity for revenge on a silver platter. I sighed, leaning back against my couch. It's not that simple. This is my career, my professional reputation. If I make this decision for personal reasons, either keeping him to prove I'm over it or firing him for revenge, I'm compromising my integrity. Emma was quiet for a moment. You're right, she finally said. And that's why you're the boss and I'm not. I'd burn it all down for satisfaction. You're thinking about the bigger picture. So what do I do? I asked. How do I make this decision objectively? I don't think you can be completely objective, Emma replied honestly. You have history. It colors everything. The question is whether you can acknowledge that bias and still make a sound professional judgment. Her words stayed with me as I prepared for my meeting with Sandra the next morning. Emma was right. Complete objectivity was impossible in this situation. The best I could do was acknowledge my personal bias and try to compensate for it. Sandra was already in the conference room when I arrived, a stack of personnel files in front of her. "Good morning, Ava," she greeted me. "Ready to make some decisions?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, taking the seat beside her. We spent the next hour going through the senior InnoMark staff one by one, discussing their performances during the transition and potential future roles. Sandra valued my input but made the final decisions, which relieved some of the pressure I felt. Finally, we reached Marcus's file. "So," Sandra said, opening his folder. "Marcus Wellington. Your recommendation?" I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. Marcus has been instrumental in the successful integration of InnoMark's clients and operations. His knowledge of their systems and relationships has made the transition much smoother than it might have been otherwise. Sandra nodded. "I agree. And going forward?" "He's expressed interest in a senior account director or strategic planning manager role," I continued. "Based on his experience and skills, either would be appropriate. He has strong strategic thinking abilities and excellent client relationship management." "But," Sandra prompted, clearly sensing my hesitation. "But I have concerns about his ability to fully integrate into Apex's culture long-term," I admitted. "There's information suggesting he was resistant to change during InnoMark's previous acquisition attempt. While he attributes that to protecting what worked in their model, it raises questions about his adaptability." Sandra considered this. "Fair concern. Though I've noticed he's been particularly accommodating during this transition. Almost unusually so, based on the reputation that preceded him." I shifted uncomfortably. "That may be due to our personal history. I'm not sure his current behavior is indicative of how he would function under different leadership." "I see." Sandra studied me for a moment. "Ava, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want an honest answer. If there was no personal history between you, would you recommend retaining Marcus Wellington?" The question cut to the heart of my dilemma. I forced myself to consider it seriously, to set aside both the pain of the past and the complex emotions of the present. "Yes," I finally said. "Based purely on his professional qualifications and performance during the transition, I would recommend offering him a position." Sandra nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Then that's what we'll do. I'll offer him the senior account director role, reporting to Jamie in the client services department. That places him outside your direct chain of command, which should alleviate some of the potential complications." The solution was elegant, acknowledging Marcus's value to the company while creating a structure that would minimize our professional interaction. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. "Thank you, Sandra. That seems like the best approach." "Don't thank me yet," she said with a wry smile. "You still need to inform him of the decision. It's your project until the transition officially concludes." And just like that, the weight settled back into place. One more conversation with Marcus. One more navigation of the treacherous waters between our personal past and professional present. I scheduled the meeting for the following afternoon, giving myself time to prepare. When Marcus arrived at my office, his expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Please sit down," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "I wanted to inform you of our decision regarding your future with Apex." Marcus sat, his posture tense but his face composed. "I appreciate you telling me personally. Sandra and I have reviewed your performance during the transition and considered your skills and experience." I continued formally. "We would like to offer you a permanent position as Senior Account Director, reporting to Jamie Chen in Client Services." The relief was evident in his expression. "Thank you, Ava. I accept the offer. I should note that this position places you outside my department," I added. "While we may occasionally work together on specific projects, our day-to-day professional interaction will be limited." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand." "That's probably for the best." An awkward silence fell between us. There seemed to be nothing left to say, yet neither of us moved to end the meeting. "Is there anything else?" I finally asked. Marcus hesitated, then spoke. "Just, thank you. I know this couldn't have been an easy decision for you. Given everything, it wasn't personal," I said, more sharply than I'd intended. "It was a business decision based on what's best for Apex." "Of course," he agreed quickly. "Still, I appreciate your professionalism. Not everyone would be able to separate the past from the present so effectively." His words felt like both a compliment and a challenge. Had I truly separated past from present? Or was the decision to retain him driven by a need to prove that he no longer had power over me? The integration project concludes officially next Friday, I said, changing the subject. After that, you'll report to Jamie. She'll be in touch about your specific responsibilities. Marcus stood, recognizing the dismissal. Thank you again, Director Mitchell. I look forward to contributing to Apex's continued success. As he left my office, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the decision was made, uncertainty about whether it was the right one, and a lingering sense of unfinished business that I couldn't quite shake. The final week of the integration project passed quickly. There were reports to finalize, loose ends to tie up, and a transition celebration to plan. I threw myself into these tasks, grateful for the distraction they provided from my thoughts about Marcus and our strange new reality. The celebration was held on Friday evening in Apex's largest conference room, transformed for the occasion with catering, drinks, and decorations. It was a chance for the merged teams to socialize in a relaxed setting, to cement the connections that had been forming over the past months. I arrived early to ensure everything was in place, greeting people as they filtered in. Sandra made a brief speech thanking everyone for their hard work, specifically acknowledging my leadership of the project. There was applause, handshakes, congratulations, all the trappings of professional success. And through it all, I was acutely aware of Marcus moving through the room, socializing with his new colleagues, occasionally glancing in my direction when he thought I wasn't looking. As the evening progressed, I found myself on the balcony that adjoined the conference room, seeking a moment of quiet amid the celebrations. The Boston skyline stretched before me, lights glittering against the darkening sky. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, letting the tension of the past few months begin to dissipate. "Quite a view," a familiar voice said from behind me. I turned to find Marcus standing in the doorway, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. He offered one to me, and after a moment's hesitation, I accepted it. "Congratulations on the successful integration," he said, moving to stand beside me at the railing, maintaining a respectful distance. "Everyone's saying it's one of the smoothest they've ever seen." "Thank you," I replied. The teams worked well together. We stood in silence for a moment, sipping our champagne and looking out at the city. "It's strange," Marcus finally said. "A year ago, I never could have imagined us standing here like this." I glanced at him. "A year ago you were in Cabo with your new girlfriend, having erased me from your life." He winced, his gaze dropping to his glass. "I deserved that." "Yes, you did." I agreed simply. "Though I'm not saying it to be cruel. It's just a fact." Marcus nodded, accepting this. "For what it's worth, that relationship ended months ago. It was a mistake from the beginning." I wasn't sure how to respond to this information. Did he expect me to feel vindicated? Satisfied? Did he think I cared? "That's not really my concern," I finally said. "No, I suppose it isn't," he acknowledged. I don't want you to think that what I did was worth it, that I found some great happiness that justified the pain I caused. Because I didn't." I turned to face him fully. "Why are you telling me this, Marcus? What do you want from me?" He met my gaze, his expression troubled. "I don't know. Forgiveness, maybe? Understanding? Some kind of closure that makes all of this less unbearable?" "Closure," I repeated. "You disappeared without a word after 5 years, and now you want closure?" "I know it's selfish," he admitted. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But being here, seeing you every day, working in this strange new dynamic, it's harder than I expected. Welcome to consequences," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "They tend to follow actions, even when you run away from them." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You've changed," he finally said. "You're stronger. More confident. It suits you." The observation caught me off guard. "Pain changes people," I replied. "So does having to rebuild your life from scratch." "I'm sorry for my part in that," he said quietly, "though I can't regret the result. This version of you is formidable." Before I could respond, the balcony door opened and Sandra appeared. "Ah, there you are, Ava. The executive team wants to toast your success." "Oh, hello, Marcus. I was just congratulating Ava on the smooth integration," Marcus said smoothly. "I'll leave you to it." He nodded to both of us and slipped past Sandra back into the main room. Sandra watched him go, then turned to me with a raised eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I assured her. "Just tying up loose ends?" As I followed her back to the celebration, I couldn't help reflecting on Marcus's words. Formidable. It wasn't a word anyone would have used to describe me a year ago. Back then, I had been deeply in love, content to build my life around someone else's dreams, secure in the belief that my future was certain. Now I was different, stronger, yes, but also more cautious, more self-reliant, more aware of my own power and capabilities. The pain of Marcus's abandonment had forged something new in me, something that had led me here, to this success, to this moment of professional triumph. In a strange way, perhaps I owed him for that transformation. Not that it justified what he had done, but it had set me on a path I might never have found otherwise. The thought was uncomfortable but undeniable. As the evening drew to a close and people began to leave, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. From the devastated woman crying on her bathroom floor to the respected director celebrating a successful major project, the distance traveled was immense. And now a new chapter was beginning, one where Marcus Wellington existed in my professional sphere but no longer occupied the center of my emotional life, one where I continued to build on the success I had created for myself, one where I was the author of my own story, not a supporting character in someone else's. It wasn't the life I had planned. It was better. The following Monday morning, I arrived at my office to find a small package on my desk. Inside was a sleek fountain pen with a note that read simply, "To writing your own story. Congratulations on your success. M.W." I held the pen for a long moment, considering its weight and meaning. Then I placed it in my drawer and turned to my computer, ready to begin the day's work. The pen was a nice gesture, but I had my own tools for writing my future. And in that future, Marcus Wellington would be a colleague, perhaps eventually a friend, but never again the center of my world. I had found my own center now, and I wasn't giving it up for anyone. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since that Tuesday morning when my world had fallen apart, I was truly excited to see how it would unfold. On my terms, in my time, with my strength leading the way. And that perhaps was the most satisfying revenge of all. 6 months had passed since the integration project concluded, and life at Apex had settled into a new normal. My success with the Innomark merger had earned me a reputation as a skilled strategist and leader, leading to a promotion to Senior Director of Marketing Operations. The new role came with expanded responsibilities, a corner office with a view of the harbor, and a seat at the leadership table for key company decisions. I'd found my stride in this elevated position, confident in ways I never would have imagined possible in those dark days after Marcus vanished from my life. The broken woman who had once sobbed on her bathroom floor seemed like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion but couldn't fully recognize in the mirror anymore. As promised, Marcus and I had minimal professional overlap. He worked primarily with the client services team, while I focused on internal operations and strategic planning. We crossed paths in all-hands meetings or company events, exchanging professional nods and occasionally participating in the same group discussions, but our day-to-day work rarely intersected. It was a carefully maintained distance that served us both well, until the Tuesday morning when Sandra called me into her office unexpectedly. "We have a situation," she said without preamble as I took a seat across from her desk. The serious set of her mouth immediately put me on alert. "What kind of situation?" I asked, mentally reviewing recent projects for potential problems. Sandra sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Jamie Chen is taking a sudden leave of absence. Her mother has been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and she's flying to California tomorrow to be with her family. We don't know when she'll be back. Possibly not for several months." "I'm so sorry to hear that," I said, genuinely concerned. Jamie had become a friend as well as a respected colleague. "Is there anything I can do to support her?" "Actually, yes," Sandra replied. "That's why I called you in. With Jamie gone, we need someone to temporarily take over leadership of the client services department." A knot of understanding began to form in my stomach. "And you want me to step in?" Sandra nodded. "You're the obvious choice, Ava. You know our systems, you understand our client relationships, and you've proven your leadership abilities. It would be a temporary arrangement until Jamie returns or we make a permanent decision about the department structure." The implications were clear, though unspoken. Taking over client services meant becoming Marcus's direct supervisor. After months of carefully maintained professional distance, we would suddenly be thrust into a hierarchical relationship that couldn't be avoided or minimized. "I understand this puts you in an awkward position given your history with Marcus Wellington. Sandra continued, addressing the elephant in the room. If you feel it would be problematic, we can explore other options. But frankly, you're the best person for the job. I took a deep breath, considering the situation from all angles. Declining would mean admitting that my personal history still had power over my professional decisions, something I'd worked hard to overcome. It might also impact my future prospects at Apex if I was seen as unwilling to step up during a crisis. I can handle it, I said with more confidence than I felt. My past with Marcus won't affect my ability to manage the department effectively. Relief crossed Sandra's face. I was hoping you'd say that. Jamie's preparing transition documents now? She'd like to meet with you this afternoon to go over everything. Of course, I agreed. I'll make myself available whenever she needs. As I left Sandra's office, my mind was already racing with the implications of this new arrangement. How would Marcus react to the news? Would he maintain the professional distance we'd established, or would this shift in our dynamic bring our complicated history back to the surface? And more importantly, could I truly separate my personal feelings from my professional judgment when it came to evaluating and directing his work? I spent the afternoon with Jamie, absorbing as much information as possible about the Client Services Department's current projects, challenges, and team dynamics. She was distracted, understandably, her mind already with her ailing mother, but she made a valiant effort to prepare me for the transition. The team is solid, she assured me as we reviewed the department org chart. They know their roles and execute them well. Your biggest challenge will probably be the Henderson account. What's happening with Henderson? I asked, making a note. They're our largest client, but they've been expressing some dissatisfaction with their recent campaign results. Marcus has been the lead on their account for the past 4 months. He's good with them, they trust him, but they're demanding and the pressure is intense. I nodded, processing this information with a growing sense of unease. The Henderson account was crucial to Apex's bottom line. Any missteps could have significant repercussions for the company, and by extension, for my career. Has Marcus been handling it well? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Jamie hesitated just long enough for me to notice. He's dedicated, works harder than anyone on the team, but he can be protective of his approach, resistant to input sometimes, especially lately. The description aligned with what I'd heard about Marcus before, the resistance to change that had been flagged during our evaluation of his future with the company. It seemed that aspect of his personality was resurfacing now that he was settled into his role. I'll keep that in mind, I said, making another note. Anything else I should know about the team or current projects? We continued our discussion until late in the evening, by which time I had filled a notebook with information and action items. Jamie would announce the temporary leadership change to her team the next morning before leaving, and I would officially take over by the afternoon. As I drove home that night, I couldn't help reflecting on the strange turns life sometimes takes. 1.5 years ago, I had been devastated by Marcus's abandonment, my sense of self shattered by his callous disappearance. Now, through a series of events I never could have anticipated, I was about to become his boss. The universe, it seemed, had a peculiar sense of irony. I slept poorly that night, my dreams a confused jumble of past and present. Marcus walking out our apartment door while I called after him. Marcus sitting across from me in a performance review as I listed his failures. Marcus looking at me with those eyes that had once made my heart race. I woke feeling unrested, the boundary between memory and imagination blurred. The morning passed in a flurry of preparation. I rearranged my own projects to accommodate my new responsibilities, briefed my team on the temporary changes to our workflow, and reviewed the Client Services Department files one more time before heading to the conference room where Jamie would be making her announcement. I arrived a few minutes early to find Jamie already there, looking exhausted but composed. "Thank you for doing this," she said quietly as I took the seat beside her. "It helps knowing the department will be in good hands." "I'll do my best," I promised. "Focus on your family. That's what matters most right now." People began filing into the room, their expressions curious about the suddenly called meeting. Marcus arrived with 2 of his team members, laughing at something one of them had said. His smile froze momentarily when he saw me sitting at the front of the room beside Jamie, a flicker of confusion crossing his features before he masked it with his usual professional demeanor. Once everyone was seated, Jamie stood and explained the situation with admirable composure, considering the circumstances. She introduced me as the interim department head, expressed confidence in the team's ability to maintain excellent client service during her absence, and promised to stay in touch as much as possible. "I know this is sudden," she concluded, "but Ava is extremely capable, and I trust her to lead this department with the same commitment to excellence that we've always maintained. Please give her your full support." Throughout Jamie's announcement, I kept my expression warm but professional, making brief eye contact with each team member, including Marcus, whose face had become unreadable, his posture slightly rigid. After Jamie finished speaking and answered a few questions, I stood to address the team. "I know this is a difficult time for all of you," I began. "Jamie is not only an exceptional leader but also a friend to many of us. My goal is to make this transition as smooth as possible while she takes the time she needs with her family. I'll be scheduling individual meetings with each of you over the next few days to discuss your current projects and any concerns you might have. In the meantime, my door is always open." The meeting concluded with well wishes for Jamie and promises of support for the transition. As people filtered out of the room, I noticed Marcus hanging back, clearly waiting for a private moment. My pulse quickened slightly as I gathered my notes, preparing for our first one-on-one interaction in this new dynamic. "Director Mitchell?" he said formally once we were alone, using the title that had become his way of maintaining professional distance. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Marcus," I replied, deliberately using his first name to establish the tone of our new relationship. "What can I do for you?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to address the unique circumstances of this arrangement directly. I know this isn't ideal for either of us, but I want to assure you that I'm committed to making it work professionally." I appreciated his directness, even as I maintained my own professional facade. "I share that commitment. Our history doesn't need to complicate our working relationship." "That's good to hear," he said, though something in his expression suggested doubt. "Jamie mentioned you'll be scheduling individual meetings with the team?" "Yes, starting tomorrow. I'd like to meet with you first, given your role with the Henderson account." "Is 9 a.m. workable for you?" "Perfectly." He nodded. "I'll prepare a comprehensive update on Henderson and my other accounts." "Thank you," I said, gathering my things to signal the end of our conversation. "I look forward to hearing your perspective." As I walked back to my office, I couldn't help analyzing every nuance of our brief exchange. Marcus had been polite, professional, even accommodating, but there had been something in his eyes that suggested wariness, perhaps even concern. Was he worried about how our personal history might affect my professional judgment? Or was there something specific about his work that he feared wouldn't meet my standards? The question lingered as I spent the rest of the day reorganizing my schedule to accommodate my new responsibilities. By the time I left the office that evening, I had created a structured plan for the coming weeks, complete with team and individual meetings, client check-ins, and project reviews. Control through organization had always been my response to uncertainty, and this situation was no exception. The next morning, I arrived early to prepare for my meeting with Marcus. I reviewed the Henderson account files, familiarizing myself with the client's history, preferences, and current campaign status. The data confirmed what Jamie had mentioned. The results were underperforming against projections, though not dramatically so. Precisely at 9, there was a knock at my door. "Come in," I called, setting aside the file. Marcus entered, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that I noted with a pang had been tailored since I'd last seen him wear it. The observation triggered an unwelcome flash of intimacy, memories of shopping together, of helping him choose suits, of teasing him about his preference for conservative colors. I pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the professional present. "Good morning," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. "Thank you for being prompt." "Of course," he replied, taking the offered seat and placing a folder on the desk between us. "I've prepared a comprehensive overview of my current accounts, with particular focus on Henderson since I understand that's a priority." "It is," I confirmed, opening his folder. "Jamie mentioned they've been expressing some dissatisfaction with recent campaign performance." A slight tightening around his eyes was the only indication that my direct approach had touched a nerve. "The results are below projections," he acknowledged, "but there are contextual factors to consider. The market segment as a whole is underperforming due to economic headwinds. Compared to their competitors, Henderson is actually maintaining market share." I nodded, scanning the detailed analysis he'd provided. His work was thorough and professionally presented, with clear data visualizations supporting his points. "This is helpful context," What's your strategy for addressing their concerns? Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from cautious to engaged as he outlined a multifaceted approach to improving campaign performance. As he spoke, I was struck by his genuine passion for the work. This wasn't just a job to him, but a creative challenge he was determined to solve. The key is customizing our messaging to reflect the changed economic reality, while still positioning Henderson as the premium option, he concluded. I have a meeting with their CMO next week to present these adjustments. I'd like to join that meeting, I said, making a note in my calendar. Not to interfere, but to demonstrate Apex's commitment to their account at the leadership level, especially during this transition period. A flicker of something, resistance perhaps, crossed his features before he nodded. Of course. I'll forward you the meeting details and background materials. We continued discussing his other accounts, all of which appeared to be in good order. Throughout the conversation, I maintained a strictly professional demeanor, asking pointed questions when needed, but also acknowledging the quality of his work where appropriate. Marcus responded in kind, his initial wariness gradually giving way to a more relaxed, though still formal, interaction. As our meeting drew to a close, I decided to address the elephant in the room directly. Before you go, Marcus, I want to clarify something. My assessment of your work will be based solely on your performance, not our personal history. I hope you believe that. He studied me for a moment, his expression thoughtful. I want to believe it, he said finally. But I'm not sure either of us can be completely objective about the other. It's human nature. His honesty caught me off guard. Perhaps, I conceded, but I'm committed to trying. I expect the same from you. You'll have it, he promised, standing to leave. Is there anything else you need from me today? Not at the moment. I'll see you at the team meeting this afternoon. After he left, I sat back in my chair, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The meeting had gone more smoothly than I'd anticipated, with both of us maintaining professional boundaries while engaging productively on work issues. If we could continue in this vein, perhaps the temporary arrangement would be manageable after all. The next 2 weeks followed a similar pattern. I met with each member of the client services team, immersed myself in their projects and challenges, and began to develop a rhythm for managing this additional responsibility alongside my existing role. The team was talented and dedicated, making the transition easier than it might have been. Marcus and I settled into a cautious professional relationship, interacting primarily in team settings or scheduled meetings about specific accounts. He was consistently prepared, responsive to requests, and respectful of my authority, though I occasionally sensed a controlled resistance when I suggested modifications to his approach, particularly regarding the Henderson account. The meeting with Henderson's CMO proved illuminating. Marcus was polished and persuasive in presenting his strategy adjustments, clearly having established a strong rapport with the client. Yet I noticed subtle signs of tension beneath the surface, the way the CMO referenced ongoing concerns. That seemed to surprise Marcus, suggestions of promises made that weren't fully documented in our files. On the drive back to the office, I broached the subject carefully. You clearly have a good relationship with their team. Marcus nodded, keeping his eyes on the road as he drove. We've worked hard to build trust. Thomas, their CMO, appreciates direct communication, even when the news isn't what he wants to hear. I noticed he mentioned some concerns about timeline commitments. Is there something I should know about that isn't in the file? A slight tightening of his hands on the steering wheel was the only indication that my question had struck a nerve. There have been some informal discussions about accelerating certain elements of the campaign. Nothing concrete or promised, just explorations of what might be possible. Those kinds of explorations should be documented, Marcus, I said, keeping my tone professional rather than accusatory. Especially with a client like Henderson, misaligned expectations can damage the relationship. I understand the protocol, he replied, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. But sometimes building client relationships requires flexibility. Thomas responds well to collaborative problem-solving in the moment, not rigid adherence to documented processes. Flexibility is important, I agreed, but so is transparency with your team and leadership. It protects both the client relationship and the company. He didn't respond immediately, his jaw working slightly as he processed my feedback. I'll ensure all discussions are properly documented going forward, he finally said, his tone formally compliant but with an undercurrent of resistance. The exchange left me uneasy. While Marcus was saying all the right things, his body language and tone suggested he viewed my feedback as unnecessary interference rather than legitimate guidance. It was the first clear indication that managing him might be more challenging than I had initially hoped. That challenge became increasingly apparent over the following weeks. Marcus continued to perform well in most aspects of his role. His client presentations were excellent, his strategic thinking sound, his campaign concepts creative and well-received. But I began to notice a pattern of selective transparency, particularly regarding the Henderson account. Information would be shared at the last minute or only when directly requested. Meetings with the client would be scheduled without sufficient notice for me to attend. Documents would be updated without version tracking, making it difficult to identify what had changed and why. None of these issues was egregious enough to warrant formal disciplinary action, but collectively they created a concerning picture, one of a talented professional who operated according to his own rules rather than company protocols. The situation came to a head in late March, 3 months into my tenure as interim head of client services. I received an unexpected call from Thomas Reynolds, Henderson's CMO, asking to speak to me directly about concerns with their account. "I've appreciated working with Marcus," Thomas said carefully, "but there have been some discrepancies between what was discussed and what's been delivered. I wanted to address this at the leadership level before it becomes a larger issue." My stomach tightened as Thomas elaborated on promises Marcus had apparently made. Timeline commitments, resource allocations, strategic pivots, none of which had been documented or approved through proper channels. Some would be difficult if not impossible to fulfill without significant disruption to other client work. "I understand your concerns, Thomas," I said when he finished, my mind already racing with the implications. "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention directly. I'll need to review the situation internally, but I assure you we value the Henderson relationship and will work to address these issues promptly." After ending the call, I sat at my desk for several long minutes, processing what I'd learned and considering my options. This wasn't a minor procedural violation or a case of imperfect communication. This was a senior team member making unauthorized commitments to our largest client, commitments that put both the client relationship and the company at risk. I would need to confront Marcus directly, but I wanted to be fully prepared. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing every document related to the Henderson account, comparing email chains, meeting notes, and official proposals against what Thomas had described. The picture that emerged confirmed my concerns. Marcus had been operating a parallel track with the client, making promises and adjustments without proper documentation or approval. At 4:30, I sent him a message asking him to come to my office at 5. His response was prompt and professional. "I'll be there." As I waited for our meeting, I found myself reflecting on our shared history, not the relationship itself, but the pattern it revealed. Marcus had always preferred to operate on his own terms, making decisions unilaterally when it suited him. It was a tendency I'd found charming in our personal life. His spontaneous weekend trips, surprise dinner reservations, unexpected gifts. But in a professional context, that same trait manifested as a disregard for process and transparency that couldn't be overlooked. Precisely at 5, he knocked on my door. "Come in," I called, steeling myself for what would inevitably be a difficult conversation. Marcus entered, his expression neutral but alert. He sensed the seriousness of the situation immediately, perhaps from the formal way I'd phrased my request, or perhaps from the tension I couldn't fully disguise. "Please close the door and take a seat," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. He complied silently, his posture relaxed, but his eyes watchful as he settled into the chair. "I received a call from Thomas Reynolds today." I began without preamble, watching his face closely for a reaction. A flicker of surprise crossed his features before he masked it. "Oh, what did Thomas want?" "He wanted to discuss concerns about commitments you've apparently made regarding the Henderson campaign, commitments that aren't reflected in any of our official documentation or approved plans." Marcus maintained his composure, though I noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Thomas and I have had some exploratory conversations about potential adjustments to improve performance. Nothing concrete has been promised." "That's not how Thomas characterized it," I countered, opening the folder containing my notes from the call. According to him, you committed to a 2-week acceleration of the next campaign phase, additional creative resources for their social media channels, and a strategic pivot toward more aggressive competitive positioning, all without internal review or approval. Thomas sometimes interprets discussions as more definitive than intended, Marcus said, his tone remaining even. I've been clear that any significant changes would require internal approval. I studied him for a moment, struck by his ability to project absolute confidence even when confronted with contradicting evidence. It was a quality that had once impressed me, his unwavering self-assurance in challenging situations. Now, I saw it differently, as a concerning inability to acknowledge error or accept feedback. Marcus, I've reviewed all the documentation for the Henderson account thoroughly. There's a consistent pattern of you making decisions and commitments without proper transparency or adherence to protocol. This isn't just about today's call from Thomas. It's about an ongoing approach that puts both the client relationship and Apex at risk. For the first time, his composure faltered slightly. I've managed this account successfully for months, he said, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. The client trusts me. Sometimes building that trust requires flexibility in how we apply internal processes. Processes exist for a reason, I replied firmly. They ensure alignment, protect the company from overcommitment, and maintain consistent quality across all client work. They're not optional guidelines to be applied when convenient. With all due respect, Ava, he said, dropping the formal title we'd maintained in professional settings, client relationships are built on trust and responsiveness, not rigid adherence to protocols. Thomas values our ability to adapt quickly to his needs. That's why Henderson has stayed with us despite the recent performance challenges. The use of my first name felt like a deliberate attempt to shift the dynamic, to remind me of our personal connection, to suggest this was a disagreement between equals rather than feedback from a supervisor to a team member. I refused to let the conversation be derailed. This isn't about flexibility versus rigidity, Marcus. It's about transparency and accountability. You can be responsive to client needs while still keeping your team and leadership informed. The two aren't mutually exclusive. He leaned forward slightly, his expression intent. In theory, perhaps, but in practice, moving at the speed Henderson requires sometimes means making judgment calls in the moment. That's what they pay us for, our expertise and ability to adapt, not our skill at documentation. I took a deep breath, recognizing that we were approaching this from fundamentally different perspectives. I understand your position, but I disagree with your approach. Going forward, I need you to document all client communications thoroughly, submit any potential changes to the approved plan for review before discussing them with the client, and include me or another senior team member in all meetings with Henderson. Marcus sat back, his expression cooling. You're micromanaging me. I'm enforcing basic professional standards, I countered. Standards that apply to everyone on the team, regardless of seniority or client relationship. Is this really about professional standards, Ava? He asked quietly, his gaze direct and challenging. Or is it about something else? The implication was clear, and it struck a nerve despite my determination to keep our personal history separate from our professional interaction. Was I being harder on Marcus because of our past? Was I unconsciously seeking to assert control as some form of delayed response to how powerless I'd felt when he disappeared from my life? I pushed the questions aside, focusing on the concrete issues at hand. This is about your handling of the Henderson account, nothing more. I would have the same conversation with any team member who bypassed protocols with our largest client. He held my gaze for a long moment, skepticism evident in his expression, before finally nodding. I understand your expectations. Is there anything else? Yes, I said, sliding a document across the desk toward him. I've outlined the specific steps needed to address the commitments you've made to Henderson. We'll need to determine which can be fulfilled within our existing resources and which need to be renegotiated. I'd like your proposed approach by tomorrow afternoon. Marcus glanced at the document but didn't pick it up. I'll review it and get back to you. Thank you, I said, signaling the end of our meeting. I'm confident we can work through this professionally. After he left, I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The conversation had gone more or less as I'd expected. Marcus had been defensive but controlled, reluctant to acknowledge the validity of my concerns, but ultimately agreeing to comply with my directives. Whether that compliance would be genuine or merely superficial remained to be seen. I was disturbed by his attempt to suggest my feedback was personally motivated rather than professionally justified. It was a manipulative tactic, designed to make me question my own judgment and back down from legitimate concerns. The fact that it had momentarily worked, causing me to second-guess my motivations, was even more troubling. The following morning, I met with Sandra to brief her on the situation with the Henderson account. As my superior and the executive ultimately responsible for client relationships, she needed to be aware of potential issues with our largest client. "I'm concerned about Marcus's approach," I concluded after explaining the situation. "He's talented and the client likes him, but his disregard for protocol creates unnecessary risk." Sandra nodded thoughtfully. "This isn't the first time we've had this conversation about Marcus." Jamie raised similar concerns before her leave of absence, though nothing quite this significant. "How do you want to handle it?" "For now, I've instituted more rigorous oversight requirements and asked him to develop a plan for addressing the existing commitments. I'll monitor the situation closely, but if the pattern continues, more formal corrective action may be necessary." "That seems reasonable," Sandra agreed. "Document everything carefully. If this does escalate to a performance issue, we'll need a clear record of the concerns and your attempts to address them." Her words resonated uncomfortably. The idea of building a case against Marcus, potentially even for termination if his behavior didn't improve, felt surreal given our history. Yet I couldn't allow personal discomfort to prevent me from fulfilling my professional responsibilities. If Marcus continued to operate outside established protocols, putting client relationships and company interests at risk, I would need to take appropriate action regardless of our past. Marcus submitted his proposed approach for the Henderson issues late that afternoon, just within the deadline I'd set. The document was professionally prepared and addressed most of my concerns, though it framed the situation as a miscommunication rather than unauthorized commitments. It was a subtle but significant distinction, positioning the problem as a matter of perspective rather than a violation of protocol. I accepted the plan with minor modifications, noting in my response that I would be joining all Henderson meetings for the foreseeable future to ensure alignment between client expectations and internal commitments. Marcus acknowledged this requirement without comment, his response cordial but minimal. Over the next few weeks, a tense détente developed between us. Marcus adhered to the letter of my directives, documenting client interactions more thoroughly, including me in meetings, submitting changes for approval, but there was a mechanical quality to his compliance that suggested he was going through the motions rather than genuinely recognizing the importance of these protocols. In team meetings, he was professionally engaged but subtly distant, contributing when required but rarely initiating discussion. With clients, he maintained his characteristic charm and strategic insight, though I noticed he occasionally glanced my way before answering questions or making suggestions, a tacit acknowledgement of the new constraints on his autonomy. The situation was functional but far from ideal. The tension between us was palpable to others, creating an undercurrent of discomfort in team interactions. Several times I considered having another direct conversation with Marcus about our working relationship, but I hesitated. Any discussion that ventured beyond strictly professional concerns risked reopening old wounds or creating new complications. Then came the Henderson presentation. After weeks of careful planning and internal review, we were scheduled to present our revised strategy to their executive team, a critical meeting that would determine the future of our relationship with our largest client. Marcus had prepared meticulously, as had the rest of the team. I had reviewed the presentation materials personally and was confident in our approach. The meeting began well. The Henderson executives seemed receptive to our analysis of the market challenges and our proposed adjustments to address them. Marcus was in his element, articulate, persuasive, responsive to questions in a way that demonstrated deep understanding of their business. Then Thomas Reynolds, the CMO, asked the question that changed everything. "This all looks promising, but I'm confused about the timeline," he said, glancing between Marcus and me. "In our conversation last week, Marcus mentioned implementing these changes by the end of the month. This presentation shows a phased rollout over 8 weeks." I felt a cold shock of realization. There had been no documented conversation last week, no meeting on the calendar, no follow-up email, no mention of an accelerated timeline in any of our internal discussions. Marcus barely hesitated. "You're right, Thomas. We discussed an accelerated option contingent on resource availability. After further internal review, we determined that the phased approach would deliver more consistent quality and sustainable results. It was a smooth recovery, but the damage was done. Thomas frowned, clearly remembering the conversation differently. That's not my recollection, Marcus. You were quite definitive about the end-of-month implementation. We've already adjusted our marketing calendar accordingly. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. I could feel the attention of everyone present shifting between Thomas, Marcus, and me, waiting to see how this discrepancy would be addressed. With a calm I didn't feel, I stepped in. Thomas, I apologize for the confusion. It seems there's been a miscommunication regarding the timeline. If I may suggest, let's take a short break. Marcus and I will review our notes and resources, and then we can discuss options for accelerating certain elements of the plan to better align with your expectations. Thomas nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. That would be helpful. As the Henderson team filed out for the break, I turned to Marcus, keeping my voice low but my words precise. My office. Now. We walked in silence to the small conference room we were using as a temporary office at the Henderson headquarters. Once inside with the door closed, I turned to face him, struggling to contain my anger. What was that? I demanded. What conversation is Thomas referring to? Marcus maintained his composure, though a flush of color had risen in his cheeks. I had a brief call with Thomas last week about some technical aspects of the implementation. He asked about accelerating the timeline, and I mentioned it might be possible for certain elements depending on resource availability. And you didn't think to document this conversation or inform me about it? After our explicit discussion about transparency and unauthorized commitments, it wasn't a formal meeting, he defended. Just a quick clarification call. I didn't commit to anything specific. Thomas is misremembering the conversation. I stared at him, momentarily speechless in the face of his denial. This was exactly the behavior I had warned him about, the very issue that had prompted our previous confrontation. Yet here he was, having done it again, seemingly unable to recognize the gravity of the situation. Marcus, this is unacceptable, I said finally, my voice controlled but firm. This is precisely the type of undocumented client communication that creates confusion and puts our relationship with Henderson at risk. We discussed this extensively just weeks ago. I understand you're upset. This isn't about me being upset, I interrupted. This is about professional conduct and basic accountability. You had a substantive conversation with our largest client about timeline expectations and didn't document it or share it with the team. Now we're blindsided in the middle of a critical presentation. He took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his own composure. You're right. I should have documented the call, but Thomas is overstating what was discussed. I never promised an end-of-month implementation for the full strategy. I studied him for a moment, trying to determine whether he genuinely believed his own justification or was simply trying to minimize his responsibility. Either possibility was concerning. We need to get through this meeting, I said finally. We'll review the resources and see what elements can be reasonably accelerated without compromising quality. After we return to the office, we'll discuss this further. Marcus nodded, relief evident in his expression at the temporary reprieve. I can work with the team to adjust the timeline for the initial phase. That would address Thomas's most immediate concerns. Fine, but I'll lead that portion of the discussion when we reconvene. The remainder of the Henderson meeting was salvaged through careful diplomacy and some genuine concessions on our timeline. Thomas seemed mollified by our willingness to accommodate his expectations, though a residue of mistrust lingered in his interactions with Marcus. By the end, we had preserved the relationship, but at a cost, both in terms of the stretched resources we would need to deliver on the accelerated elements and in the damage to our credibility. On the drive back to the office, neither of us mentioned the incident. We discussed logistics for the adjusted timeline, assigned responsibilities for communicating the changes to the team, and reviewed other aspects of the presentation that had gone well. The professional veneer held, but beneath it lay a fundamental breach that couldn't be ignored. The following morning, I requested a meeting with Sandra before addressing the situation with Marcus. I needed her guidance on how to proceed, given the seriousness of the issue and the potential implications for both Marcus's position and our relationship with Henderson. He did it again, after explicit warnings and a clear directive, Sandra said when I finished explaining what had happened. That crosses the line from a communication issue to a performance problem. I agree, I said, though the words felt heavy. The question is how to address it appropriately. Sandra leaned back in her chair, studying me thoughtfully. You know the options, Ava. A formal performance improvement plan outlining specific behaviors that need to change, with clear consequences if they don't. Or given that this is a repeated issue affecting our largest client, immediate termination would also be justified. The word termination landed with a weight I hadn't anticipated. It was one thing to recognize that Marcus's behavior was problematic. It was another to contemplate being the one to end his employment at Apex. The personal history between us made the prospect uncomfortably complex. I'm concerned about my ability to be objective in this situation, I admitted. Given our past? Sandra nodded, her expression sympathetic but firm. That's a valid concern, and I appreciate your self-awareness. But consider this. Would you hesitate to recommend termination for any other employee who repeatedly violated protocol with our largest client, creating significant risk for the company? If the answer is no, then your hesitation isn't about professional judgment but personal history. Her logic was sound, cutting through my tangled emotions with clarity. If it had been anyone else on the team, I wouldn't have hesitated. The behavior was clearly unacceptable, had continued despite explicit warnings, and had created tangible risk for a critical client relationship. The professional case for termination was strong. You're right, I acknowledged. From a purely professional standpoint, termination is justified. That said, Sandra continued, I understand the complexity of your position. If you'd prefer, I can handle the termination discussion directly. You've documented the issues thoroughly and attempted to address them through appropriate channels. I can take it from here. Her offer was tempting, a way to reach the necessary outcome without having to be the one to deliver it, but something in me resisted. Perhaps it was pride, a desire to prove to myself that I could separate personal history from professional responsibility. Or perhaps it was a deeper need for closure, for a definitive ending to the long, tangled story between Marcus and me. No, I said after a moment's reflection. I should handle it. It's my department, my direct report, my responsibility. I just needed to confirm that termination is an appropriate response to the situation. It is, Sandra assured me. And Ava? This isn't about your past with Marcus. This is about his repeated failure to meet basic professional standards. Don't let him convince you otherwise. Her warning resonated, a reminder of how Marcus had tried to deflect my earlier feedback by suggesting it was personally motivated. I would need to be prepared for similar tactics in what would undoubtedly be a difficult conversation. Thank you, Sandra. I'll schedule the meeting for this afternoon. Back in my office, I prepared methodically for what would be one of the most challenging conversations of my professional career. I reviewed the documentation of the issues with Marcus's performance, organized the timeline of events and interventions, and coordinated with HR to ensure all necessary paperwork was prepared. By 2 o'clock, everything was in place. I sent Marcus a meeting request for 4 o'clock, marked high priority with no agenda specified. His acceptance came within minutes, accompanied by a brief message. Is this about the Henderson presentation? I've adjusted the timeline as discussed and informed the team of the changes. I didn't respond, preferring to have the entire conversation in person rather than beginning it piecemeal via email. The hours until the meeting passed with excruciating slowness, each minute stretching as my mind rehearsed possible scenarios and responses. Despite my preparation, a knot of tension had formed in my stomach, a physical manifestation of the emotional complexity of what I was about to do. At precisely 4 o'clock, Marcus knocked on my office door. Come in, I called, my voice steadier than I felt. He entered, his expression cautiously neutral as he assessed my demeanor. You wanted to see me? Yes, please close the door and have a seat. As he settled into the chair across from my desk, I noticed a slight tension in his posture, an awareness that this wasn't a routine meeting. Perhaps he had sensed the seriousness in my tone, or perhaps Sandra's assistant had already begun the necessary HR preparations that might have hinted at what was coming. I didn't delay or soften the message. Marcus, after careful consideration and consultation with senior leadership, I've made the difficult decision to terminate your employment with Apex, effective immediately. His expression shifted from wariness to shock, then quickly to disbelief. What? Because of the Henderson miscommunication? That's completely disproportionate. This isn't about a single miscommunication, I replied evenly. It's about a pattern of behavior that has continued despite explicit warnings and opportunities for correction. You've repeatedly bypassed established protocols, made unauthorized commitments to our largest client, and failed to document critical client interactions. These actions have created significant risk for both the client relationship and the company. Marcus leaned forward, his composure cracking slightly. This is absurd. I've consistently delivered exceptional work for Apex. The clients trust me. One misunderstanding about a timeline doesn't erase months of successful account management. It's not one misunderstanding, Marcus, I countered, opening the folder containing my documentation. We've had multiple discussions about these issues, including a formal warning just weeks ago after similar unauthorized commitments to Henderson. You agreed to change your approach, but the behavior has continued unchanged. So give me another chance, he argued, a note of desperation entering his voice. Put me on a performance plan. This reaction is extreme and unjustified. I maintained my composure, though his growing agitation made it challenging. A performance plan is appropriate when someone shows a willingness to recognize and address problematic behaviors. Your response today, like your response to previous feedback, suggests you don't fundamentally see your actions as problematic. You're defending and minimizing rather than acknowledging the legitimate concerns. Is that what this is really about? He asked, his tone shifting toward accusation. My failure to show sufficient contrition? Or is it something else entirely, Ava? Because from where I'm sitting, it seems convenient that you've found a professional justification to punish me for personal reasons. And there it was. The deflection I had anticipated, the attempt to reframe a legitimate professional issue as a personal vendetta. Even knowing it was coming, the accusation stung. For a brief moment, I questioned myself again. Was there some unconscious motivation influencing my decision? Was I being harder on Marcus than I would have been on someone else? But Sandra's earlier question echoed in my mind. Would I hesitate to terminate any other employee who had engaged in the same pattern of behavior? The honest answer was no. This wasn't about punishing Marcus for the past. It was about holding him accountable for his present actions, just as I would any other team member. This decision is based solely on your professional conduct, I said firmly. Your handling of the Henderson account and your repeated violations of company protocol would warrant termination regardless of who you were or what history we might have. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, his expression a complex mixture of anger, disbelief, and something that might have been hurt. You don't believe that? He said quietly. Not really. This is personal, Ava. We both know it. The use of my first name again, an attempt to shift the dynamic from professional to personal, to remind me of our shared history, to appeal to emotions rather than reason. I refuse to be drawn in. HR has prepared the necessary paperwork, I continued, maintaining my professional tone. They'll escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings, and then to the exit. You'll receive information about your final paycheck and benefits in the packet they provide. So that's it? He asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. After everything, our history, my work here, you're going to fire me and have security walk me out like a criminal? This is standard procedure for all terminations, I explained. It's not personal, Marcus. Stop saying it's not personal, he interrupted, his voice rising slightly before he controlled it again. Everything between us is personal, Ava. You can pretend otherwise, you can hide behind HR protocols and company policies, but we both know the truth. You wanted this power. You wanted to be the one to decide my fate after I took that power from you before. His words struck closer to home than I would have liked to admit, touching on insecurities I thought I had overcome. Had some part of me taken satisfaction in this role reversal? Had some wounded fragment of my past self been waiting for this moment of reckoning? Perhaps. I was human, after all, with human emotions and human flaws. But that didn't make the professional concerns any less valid, or the decision any less necessary. I understand you're upset, I said, keeping my voice steady. That's natural in this situation. But your termination is based on documented performance issues that would warrant the same response for any employee. I've requested that HR provide you with copies of all relevant documentation, which you're welcome to review. Marcus laughed, a short, bitter sound. Always so proper, so by the book. That's the Ava I remember, hiding behind rules and processes to avoid facing messy emotions. I guess some things never change. The personal attack was deliberately aimed to wound, to provoke an emotional response that would validate his claim that this was about our history rather than his performance. I refused to give him that satisfaction. I'll ask HR to come in now, I said, reaching for my phone. Unless you have specific questions about the termination process. Just one, he said, his voice suddenly quiet and intent. Does this feel like closure, Ava? Does firing me heal what I did to you when I left? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the pain and complexity of our shared past. For a moment, I allowed myself to consider it honestly. This isn't about closure, Marcus, I finally replied. It's about accountability for your actions, not from a year and a half ago, but from the past few months. Whatever closure I needed, I found it long before you walked back into my life. Something in my tone must have conveyed the truth of my words, because he studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. I believe you, he said, sounding faintly surprised. You really did move on, didn't you? Yes, I said simply. I had to. A knock at the door interrupted whatever he might have said next. The HR representative had arrived to complete the termination process. Marcus stood, straightening his suit jacket with a gesture that seemed like an attempt to reclaim some dignity. For what it's worth, he said quietly as the door opened. I'm sorry. For everything. I nodded, acknowledging his words without responding directly. Some apologies came too late to matter, yet still deserved recognition. The HR representative entered, her expression professionally neutral. Mr. Wellington? I'm Claire from Human Resources. If you're ready, I'll accompany you to collect your things. Marcus gave me one final look, a complex gaze that contained too many emotions to decipher, before turning to follow Claire from the office. The door closed behind them, leaving me alone with the weight of what had just transpired. I sat motionless for several minutes, processing the intensity of the encounter. Despite the emotional complexity, I felt surprisingly steady. The decision had been professionally sound, the execution as humane as possible under the circumstances. I had done my job, nothing more and nothing less. Eventually, I began gathering the documents spread across my desk, returning them to their folder with methodical precision. As I did, I noticed my hands were perfectly steady. No tremor, no physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil I might have expected. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. A tangible sign of how far I had come from the shattered woman who had once cried on her bathroom floor. My phone buzzed with a text from Sandra. All done? Come see me when you have a moment. I found her in her office, reviewing reports with her characteristic focus. She looked up as I entered, her expression questioning. It's done, I confirmed, taking the seat she indicated. HR is handling the exit process now. How did he take it? I considered the question, searching for words that could capture the complexity of what had transpired. About as well as could be expected. He was upset, of course, tried to frame it as personally motivated. Sandra nodded. That's not surprising. It's easier to believe you've been treated unfairly than to accept responsibility for your own actions. Yes, I agreed, though I found myself feeling a surprising sympathy for Marcus despite everything. He had made mistakes, professional and personal, but there was something sad about watching someone unable to recognize their own patterns or accept accountability for their consequences. Are you okay? Sandra asked, her tone softening slightly. That couldn't have been easy given your history. I'm fine, I said, and realized with mild surprise that it was true. It was difficult but necessary. The right decision professionally. And personally? I considered her question carefully. Personally? I think it was necessary too, just in a different way. A reminder that I can make hard decisions objectively, even when they involve complicated emotions. Sandra smiled slightly. That's a valuable skill and rarer than you might think. Many people never learn it. We discussed the practical next steps, how to communicate the change to the team, the transition plan for Marcus's accounts, the potential need for additional support for the Henderson relationship. Throughout the conversation, I maintained my professional focus, pushing aside the lingering emotional echoes of my final exchange with Marcus. Later that evening, as I drove home through the quiet streets of Boston, those emotions resurfaced. Not grief or anger or vindication, nothing so simple or clear-cut. Instead, I felt a complex mixture of sadness for what had been lost, compassion for both the person I had been and the person Marcus still was, and a quiet certainty that I had acted with integrity in an impossible situation. The rain that had threatened all day finally began to fall, droplets streaking across my windshield in chaotic patterns. I found myself thinking about the strange journey that had brought me to this point, from the devastated woman abandoned without explanation to the confident professional who had just made one of the most difficult decisions of her career. If someone had told me on that terrible Tuesday when Marcus disappeared that someday I would become his boss and eventually fire him, I would have thought they were cruel or crazy. The idea would have seemed like a fantasy of revenge, a childish wish for karma to balance the scales. But the reality had been nothing like a revenge fantasy. There had been no satisfaction in terminating Marcus, no sense of triumph or vindication, just the weighted responsibility of making a necessary decision based on clear evidence and the complex emotions that came with it. Perhaps that was the ultimate sign of healing, that when the moment came that might have offered perfect revenge, all I had felt was the burden of doing what was right rather than what was easy. Not because I had forgiven Marcus for the pain he had caused me, but because I had grown beyond needing that pain to define me. As I pulled into my driveway, the rain falling harder now, I realized something important. Today had not been about getting revenge or finding closure. It had been about demonstrating to myself that I could face the most complicated emotional terrain of my professional life and navigate it with integrity. It had been proof that the strength I had built over the past year and a half was real and lasting. Inside my home, the space I had created entirely for myself, I kicked off my shoes and poured a glass of wine. Standing by the window, watching the rain transform the world outside into a blur of motion and reflected light, I offered a silent toast to the woman I had become. Not because she had fired the man who broke her heart, but because when faced with that impossible situation, she had done what was right, rather than what was easy or satisfying. Because she had found the strength to act from principle rather than pain. The rain fell harder, drumming against the windows in a soothing rhythm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, explaining Marcus's departure to the team, reassuring the Henderson account, potentially searching for a replacement. But tonight, in this moment of quiet reflection, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me, but by what I had built from its aftermath. Not a victim of abandonment, but the architect of my own reconstruction. Not someone seeking revenge, but someone who had found something far more valuable, the power to act with compassion, even in the face of past pain. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling across the sky in waves. I stayed by the window, watching nature's drama unfold, feeling strangely peaceful despite the turbulence of the day. The worst had happened, both personally and professionally, and I had survived. More than survived, I had thrived. Whatever came next, I was ready. Not because life had been kind, it hadn't, but because I had learned that my strength was not determined by what happened to me, but by how I chose to respond. That knowledge, hard-won through heartbreak and challenge, was worth more than any revenge could ever be. As the storm began to subside, its fury spent, I raised my glass one more time, not to the past with its pain and betrayal, but to the future with its limitless possibilities. My future, on my terms, in my time, with my strength leading the way. And in that moment, I was finally completely free.